Today, the Committee on Oversight and Reform will hold its second hearing to examine how the Sackler family caused America's opioid epidemic, one of the deadliest public health crises in our nation's history. We will hear how they researched it, how they planned it, how they manufactured it, how they sold it, how they marketed it, and ultimately how they profited beyond billions from the sale of OxyContin. And we will hear also of the pain and suffering of the people who became addicted to it. Last December, after being threatened with subpoenas, David Sackler and Kathy Sackler testified before this committee about how their family pushed Purdue Pharma executives to flood the market with the dangerous painkiller, OxyContin, and deceive the public about its addictive potential. During the hearing, Kathy Sackler, who previously served as vice president of the company and on its board of directors, refused to apologize for her family's central role in causing the opioid epidemic. When I asked her whether she would apologize for the role she played in the opioid epidemic, she said, and I quote, "There is nothing I can find that I would have done differently," end quote. Over the past 2 decades, nearly 500,000 people in the United States have died as a result of the opioid epidemic. Yet there's not a single thing that the Sacklers would have done differently. It's shocking and appalling, and it shows why we desperately need accountability for the Sacklers' deadly, outrageous conduct. COVID-19 has claimed 597,000 American lives, so the opioid epidemic is nearly as deadly as the worst pandemic in modern history. And there's no vaccine for opioid addiction. Since the committee's December hearing, even more information has come to light concerning the Sacklers' deadly disregard for human life. Much of this information has been brought forward by Patrick Radden-Queef, whose recently published book, Empire of Pain, reveals disturbing new details of the Sacklers' stewardship and leadership at Purdue Pharma and in the opioid epidemic. In his book, Mr. O'Keefe provides a horrifying account of how the Sacklers disregarded reports of OxyContin's misuse as the opioid crisis ignited, pushed Purdue's executives to sell more and more and more of the dangerous prescription painkiller as the crisis has raged, and heartlessly blaming those experiencing addiction in order to protect OxyContin and its profits. Mr. Keefe's book also raises serious questions about how our federal regulatory agencies fell short in their mission to keep Americans safe, and how a lack of proper guardrails between government and industry fueled this deadly public health crisis. It is a privilege to have Mr. Keefe with us today. Since Purdue bought OxyContin to market in 1996, the company has generated more than $35 billion in revenue from its sales. During that same period, the Sackler family withdrew more than $10 billion from the company. I'm outraged that the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma have profited off of the suffering of so many families and communities. And instead of accepting responsibility for the harm that they've caused, the Sacklers are seeking to use a loophole in our bankruptcy system to evade accountability. In March, I introduced the SACKLER Act with Congressman DeSagne. The SACKLER Act would ensure that bad actors who have not filed for bankruptcy but are hiding behind their companies that have filed for bankruptcies, like the Sacklers, to make sure that they are not prohibited from using the bankruptcy process to obtain legal release from government lawsuits brought against them. The Sacklers can't have it both ways. For years, they have falsely claimed that the family is not involved with Purdue's reckless marketing and dishonest marketing of the addiction prospects of OxyContin. But at the same time, they're trying to evade accountability by obtaining legal releases for themselves through the Purdue bankruptcy. What's worse, they're actually going to retain their ownership of their foreign opioid manufacturers for several years. And they're proposing to pay the $4.2 billion settlement they're contributing, the $4.2 billion they're giving to the settlement, by selling more opioids overseas. It's deeply disappointing that the Department of Justice has been complicit in devising this plan to let the Sacklers off the hook. And I will be writing Attorney General Merrick Garland to ask him to reconsider DOJ's position. The plan is a slap in the face to the millions of people who have been directly harmed by their actions. The SACKLER Act is a common-sense reform that's been co-sponsored by 50 members of Congress, has been endorsed by dozens of patient treatment and corporate accountability organizations, and is supported by both Democratic and Republican state attorney generals. I'd like to insert the list of groups that have endorsed the bill into the record, and also editorial boards that have endorsed the SACKLER Act. The Boston Globe said that Congress needs to pass this bill to, quote, ensure that state attorneys generals never again have to rely on the individual judges to guard against this misuse of bankruptcy courts, end quote. And the Scranton Times-Tribune wrote that, and I quote, people harmed by others' wayward misconduct should not be precluded from compensation through inappropriate use of bankruptcy protections. Congress should pass the bill, end quote. It's imperative that Congress act swiftly to prevent the Sacklers and other bad actors like them from manipulating the bankruptcy system to evade accountability for their actions. The Sacklers have gotten away with a slap on the wrist. They've done it before, and it didn't deter them. They went right back into selling even more potent, dangerous versions of OxyContin. So we need real accountability this time, not just another slap on the wrist. Usually when you kill someone, you go to jail. When you read all the documents, they killed almost 500,000 people. Before I turn to the ranking member, I would like to recognize the distinguished gentleman from California and a leader in this committee's efforts to hold the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma accountable, Congressman Mark DeSalle.